Now I'll go back and share. There we are. Okay. Go.
Oh, sorry.
Bye. Thank you.
I was trying to turn off the
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah.
I apologize.
No worries.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's gonna. There we are. Let's reset again. All is well again. Okay. So this is near the end of our ongoing series that we call Church 101. And by we, I guess that's a royal we. I call it Church 101. And we're nearing the end. One more week next week, which we'll get to in just a second, is about allowing you some time to ask questions. Oh, come on. My click isn't working. Well, that's annoying. All right, we'll do it the old-fashioned way. Or we won't. There we go. Okay. Well, I got to make this window smaller so I don't get distracted by it and move it. The things they didn't teach me in seminary. Okay, so we've been through this series since March 6th. Today is May 29th. The topic of the day is we are the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement. I'll get to that in a moment. Next week, I'm allowing time for questions. I have filler if you don't have any questions. But if you have questions, next week would be good. And then the bishop is here in 2 weeks. And I know Adrian is one of those who is going to be received when the bishop comes. Talk to me more. All right. Last week, we ended with this image of Queen Elizabeth. James and I haven't talked this all out yet.
Got it.
So I don't presume to speak for James.
I'd like to have a conversation on that.
Yeah. Last week we ended with this image of an actress playing Queen Elizabeth. Clearly, that's not the original photo. And she looks very happy with herself in that image, and I like it because it reflects the happy state of where we ended in terms of our own development as a tradition with that whole Reformation. And so what comes out of that is referred to often as the Elizabethan Settlement, where we decided that everything in our past wasn't bad, just some of it needed to be fixed. And so we could emerge from the controversies that spread throughout Europe in the church, where some remained clearly Roman Catholic, and some countries, it fell out by nation states generally. Some countries would be Roman Catholic, would remain Catholic, and some countries would be very much not. So in Germany, you're going to be Lutheran. In France, you're going to remain Catholic. In Italy, of course, you're going to be Catholic. Those are the state churches. But in England, the form that took was a little different, and we created established a church that was, in our estimation of things, our description of things, both Catholic in many senses of the word, holding with traditions, holding with bishops and priests and deacons, a calendar of the church year, sacraments that were widely understood to be valid, but reformed because of so many of the abuses that were associated with that. So the things like selling of indulgences and superstitions, as they were described in the first prayer book of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. Some of those things were very clearly rebutted and rejected, and an attempt made to fix them. But we didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. That's our Elizabethan settlement. So I ended there and I start there today because today I want to talk about what happens in colonial America. So in America, we have some new challenges. The Church of England is a colonial church. And when America separates itself from England, it becomes awfully hard for the Church of England to have any real legitimacy in the eyes of new Americans. This image that I have on the screen is from a Church of England prayer book that was in use in the colonies. And it's hard to see this, but what they did, somebody here looked at some of the texts and some of the prayers and says, most heartily we beseech thee with thy favor to behold our most glorious sovereign Lord King George, and they drew a line through it. They were not going to pray a prayer like that for King George. He was not our sovereign. Thank you very much. And it creates a challenge. What will the Church of England do in the colonies when the colonies are no more? That's the challenge. And it's also the opportunity. So the two images I have on the screen there, famous portrait of the Constitutional Congress meeting in Philadelphia, and not so famous, but a rendering of Christ Church in Philadelphia. So while the nation is being born, so too is the Episcopal Church being born. Christ Church, the rector was William White. William White was also part of the Constitutional Congress, both in Philadelphia. William White became the first presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, was also bishop of the Diocese of Pennsylvania. They didn't need to leave one job to take on another in those days. It was amazing. You could be rector, bishop, presiding bishop, all at once. Wow. I hope he had staff.
Yeah.
But the expectations were different, of course, in those days as well. Both are born of the same ideas. So democracy is a core value theoretically in our United States and in our church. And let me see, I don't remember now where my slides go. Okay, I didn't remember it in that order. Okay. Oh, I changed the order of things. So out of that time period, 1789, actually the year of that Constitutional Congress, it's also the year of the first General Convention of the Episcopal Church. And at that first General Convention of the Episcopal Church, we adopted a prayer book, that small box there on the left, a prayer book for the new Episcopal Church. There's a ratification of that prayer book in our current prayer book. If you look early on page 8, you see the ratification of that first Book of Common Prayer, and follows that is the preface. It is a most invaluable part of that blessed liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, that in his worship different forms, and so on and so forth. So that notion that we can reform ourselves is steeped first in our Anglican, our Church of England heritage, and then in our colonial, our new independent state as well. And they formed that Episcopal Church in ways that very closely mirror forms of governance in the United States. And those are not accidental. Those are very much intentional, and they are believed to be God-given inalienable rights. And so you'll see the way the dioceses of the Episcopal Church break down in our current time. And you'll note that they follow, to a very large degree, state lines. So Eastern Oregon, you see, is divided in two, but it's one state now separated, but it was originally one diocese of Oregon. They've often broken up into smaller dioceses within a state, but they always follow state lines, or generally, not always, almost always. Navajo land, you'll see down here in the Southwest, covers a circle that does 3 of the 4 states down there. Only 3. I don't know why the Colorado section doesn't get thrown in there, but it seems like it does.
What happens to so it's Yellowton is for Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota all one?
No. So in Wisconsin, you have actually 3 dioceses in Wisconsin: Eau Claire, Fond du Lac, and Diocese of Wisconsin. And then you have the Diocese of Upper Michigan.
Okay.
What are the colors? designate?
I don't know what the color, oh, the colors are sizes. So this purple is 50,000 plus members.
So is this current?
This is from 2002. So no, it's not current. It's illustrative still. So you can see, in fact, where you have some population centers, and you'll note that there's more color in the east because there is a higher density of Episcopalians in the east where there's a higher density of people.
Dad,
Yes.
Dad, would you repeat questions when they're asked, please?
Oh, I will ask you here in the room to try and speak up, and I will also try to remember to do that. So we're just talking about what those colors mean, and those colors have something to do with numbers within a diocese, but this is all dated in 2002. So it's illustrative, but not necessarily very close. There's also, you'll note, the Convocation of American Churches in Europe, which is in Province 2. We broke it up regionally as well. And Province 2 includes those European churches, which are in Belgium, Paris, or Paris, Frankfurt, Germany, and elsewhere. The Virgin Islands are there. I think maybe Cuba is there now too. I'm not sure exactly why it went there, but I think when we took Cuba back into the Episcopal Church, it went to Province 2. Our province, Province 8, is this western region, which includes Hawaii and Taiwan, which makes it interesting. When we have convocation meetings on Zoom, we do it at 7 o'clock on a Friday night, which is rude, but it would be ruder to folks in Taiwan to make them do it at some other time. This way they get to do it at 10 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. Friday night Zoom meetings are not fun. So anyhow, but beyond what you see on the map, there come other points of similarity. We have a bicameral legislature, which is to say bishops don't rule us no more than we would accept the rule of a king or an archbishop. We didn't name our first presiding bishop nor bishops that succeeded an archbishop of the Episcopal Church. We named them presiding bishops. They preside over the house of bishops. And it's mostly just a matter, historically, it was I should say, it was a matter of seniority. It has since become, of course, something different as society has changed, requires changes to be made. But the presiding bishop was not originally intended to be lord over the church, nor can Michael Curry, in fact, exercise that kind of authority even now. He serves as the head officer of the House of Bishops. But the House of Bishops cannot do anything legislative to the rest of us. They can't boss us around that way. We have a House of Deputies. So this is like the Senate and the House in our governance. We have a House of Deputies. And for something to become the law of the church, it requires the agreement in every detail. So you have reconciliation. We have that at the Episcopal Church level too of governance. If the House of Bishops adopts a policy or a rule or a change, it goes to the House of Deputies. And if we agree with it, it becomes the law of the church. If the House of Deputies says, well, we mostly like it, but not this piece of it, it goes back for reconciliation and they have to agree. So it's that very complicated, convoluted sometimes process. But what it means is nobody rules over anybody else. The House of Deputies has clergy and laity in it. And there's some of that same checks and balances in that structure as well. So we don't have a church which allows the lay people alone to do whatever the heck they want, nor do they have to do what I say, nor do I have to do what the bishop says in every circumstance. And that's just built into the fabric of it. And it's worked for us pretty well, by and large. It gave birth to the Episcopal Church, which held on to its traditions. It's the same idea as with the Elizabethan Settlement, that we held on to what we think are the best parts of our tradition, even as we reformed ourselves for our current needs. It gave birth to the Episcopal Church. It also gave birth, I would argue, to something that we call Anglicanism. Because before the Episcopal Church did what we did, nobody thought we could do something like that. It was just going to be the Church of England. all over the world, lording over its subjects wherever it went. But that fell apart for good reason, we would argue. And what came out of that was a worldwide Anglican Communion, again, a map that is only suggestive, illustrative, which shows that you have all of these independent provinces of the Anglican Church in different parts of the world. And we don't all do things the same, which has been a huge frustration for other members of our Anglican Communion. Now, prior to 2003, I always taught about the Anglican Communion, and I talked about how it was wonderful. What's wonderful if I go to England to feel like I'm part of that church. When I worship in a Church of England church, I don't feel like I'm worshiping in a foreign land. It feels like home to me. And that's a wonderful thing. It's not my church in the same way, but it still feels like home to me. And so I always celebrated Anglicanism. And I knew that if I ever went to New Zealand, I could worship in a Church of New Zealand church and I would feel like I was home again. And when I worship in the Church of Ireland church, which is not the same as the Church of England, it still felt like home to me. Same thing with Wales and Scotland, which all have their somewhat different pieces of that expression.
That's true for Italy as well, on the Catholic Church.
It wouldn't be quite the same with a Catholic church.
Not,
No. If I were a Roman Catholic, wherever I worship in the Roman Catholic Church. It's my church. As an Episcopalian, I worship in a church of Australia. And I feel like home, but it isn't really my church. It's not the same church. Exactly. But we have communion.
right.
And the worship styles will feel, a pattern will feel very similar, though the words may differ. And again, there's the Roman Catholic Church, the system disseminates what the worship will be worldwide. And if it's English language, it's going to follow the missal in that language.
Is there,
Those expressions will be different in different parts of the Anglican Communion.
is there an Anglican church in Chile?
I don't know specifically to Chile. It looks like there's something, but I don't know that I can answer that definitively. But that gave birth to something, and the frustration. I mean, again, I taught that before 2003. In 2003, the Episcopal Church gave consent to the election of Gene Robinson as bishop. Gene Robinson, openly gay. That was a struggle within the Episcopal Church, but we gave consent. And this was done at General Convention, which is a little unusual. At convention, we gave consent, which is to say a majority of bishops gave consent, a majority of lay folks in the House of Deputies gave consent, and a majority of clergy in the House of Deputies gave consent. The church gave its consent to that election. It was hard internally because not every Episcopalian agreed then, nor probably to this day, not every Episcopalian agreed still that was okay, because he was gay and open and in a partnered relationship. And by the way, a truly sacred man. But that's a whole other story. But the Anglican Communion went crazy. And folks in the Episcopal Church said, how can you do that to the Anglican Communion? You're destroying the Anglican Communion. To which my response was, none of you cared before this moment. All of a sudden, this becomes a deal breaker, which really ticked me off. I had taught about the Anglican Communion beforehand. I don't know very many people that spent much time talking about it beforehand, but a lot of conservative Episcopalians talked about it a lot since then to this day. But the Anglican Communion was never the kind of structure we have in the Roman Catholic Church. It was never a thing that was so codified, frankly, that it could be destroyed. Because it was always just a communion of different churches with our own different ways of doing things. Now, in very conservative parts of the world, Africa primarily, Anglican churches in Africa, which by the way are numerically larger by a long shot than the Episcopal Church, Anglican churches in Africa got really upset and told then presiding bishop, Frank Griswold in 2003, wasn't it? So, are they, do you remember? Yeah, I think so. Told Frank Griswold to get this church whipped into shape. And Frank was my bishop for a number of years. I'm on a first name basis with him legitimately, I would say. Last time I saw him, he came up to me, rubbed my belly, said, "Jedediah." I was like, where does that come from? But it was just friendly. But Frank, he was in a bind because he had to respond, and presiding bishops in the years since have repeated this and reiterated this to other bishops. I don't get to tell them what they do, what they believe. That's the way it works in some parts of the church in Africa. Bishops are very much, they do archbishops in different parts of the world. And they are large and in charge of the church in their countries. Not the Episcopal Church. We decide what we believe, what we hold to be true. And one of the things we now have affirmed, we together, bishops, clergy, laity, is equal access and not restricted by race, gender, sexual orientation, but equal access to all the sacraments of the church on the part of all members of the church. And that's because we as people have spoken. Yes, David, and the other David. Actually, two Davids, I'm sorry.
A connection between the question about Argentina, Chile, and Europe. That I think is called the province of the Southern Cone.
Might be.
And I believe that there are dissident Episcopalians in our country that are affiliated with it. Well, over the years, there have been several groups that have splintered off the Episcopal Church, going back to the 70s with the adoption of the current prayer book and the ordination of women. And in more recent years, although now we're talking about 20 years ago, issues around sexuality. So there have been groups, and there's a fairly significant group, GAPCON is its abbreviation. I can't remember what the letters all stand for, but there is a group of people who have agreed to come together, and they have petitioned the Archbishop of Canterbury to recognize them as the Anglican Church in the United States. And so far, at least, nobody has taken that seriously. But it's a struggle for the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it's not mine. David, other David.
Just a quick thumbnail review, if you could. The difference and similarities between Anglican Communion and the Episcopal Church.
The question has to do with differences and similarities between Anglican Communion and the Episcopal Church. And I think that the similarity is we all do identify ourselves as descendants of that Church of England tradition. That's clearly part of it, and so that's built into our DNA a little bit. But it's derived in that same way, and it's familial, if you will. Whereas the Episcopal Church is a governmental entity. It's a clear, defined church tradition, which gets expressed with canons and prayer books and other sorts of things. Yeah. What we say,
I was going to say probably the prayer book.
and the prayer book, yeah, absolutely. The prayer book in our tradition has served to unify us. That goes back to the Church of England. One of the things it did in England and throughout the world is it standardized English language. Because prior to the Book of Common Prayer, there were all kinds of variations on how things got spelled. But the prayer book actually defined for everybody how certain words got spelled. It also unified tradition. And in the Episcopal Church, we adopted our own prayer book in that same spirit. It became essential for us to identify ourselves as the Episcopal Church, originally in the United States. It's since become a little bit more international. Again, dated, this is 2008. It does show some of the stresses. In 1900, that first circle, the pie chart, most Anglicans were British. By 2005,
most Anglicans were African. We evangelized that continent really well. We also exported lots of Victorian mores in the process, which is part of the conflict. We did such a good job of exporting Anglicanism that we also exported a lot of attitudes that weren't inherent by our definitions of the gospel. And you see other parts of the world represented that way, but that's the biggest shift. And then it comes back to governance. Episcopal Church 80th General Convention is this summer. I've already talked a fair amount about it. I'm not going to belabor it too much. I will say it's a tragedy to many of us. Tragedy is maybe overstated. It's a heartache. That's maybe not too strong. A disappointment. Let's just leave it at that. It's been greatly curtailed in the last few weeks. The plan had been going for a full convention. And in the last few weeks, they've said, we can't do a full convention. We can't have all the displays. We can't have guests. We can't have lots of other things going on. We can't have it going on for as many days as it normally takes. It's going to be 4 days long. It's going to be a lot of travel for 4 days. And I suspect those 4 days, I haven't seen how the calendar plays out. I suspect we're going to be sitting in a convention hall, debating, deliberating, voting, and that's essential. But it's at times the more tedious parts of the work. The fun parts are not going to be there as much. Terry Ramsdorf and I are deputies from this diocese. Terry, obviously a lay deputy. I'm an ordained, a clergy deputy. Barbara Reynolds Mayo, in the corner there in my screen, is a deputy, but because of her own care, is not going to be going, and so an alternate will probably go in her place. We've all had to wrestle with whether or not it's okay, so we've shifted our group a little bit in the last couple of weeks as this has come down to us what's going to happen. Again, we'll have more. Terry and I will have a report to offer on July, whatever it is, after convention, 17th, I think it is. And that brings us to where we are today. That's Michael Curry, our presiding bishop. He is the presiding bishop of the House of Deputies. The bishops elected him. The other house ratified that, but it was their election because he's the head of that house. We have our own president, the president of the House of Deputies, Gay Clark Jennings, who's wonderful. She is going to be replaced. Her term is up this year. And so she's going to have a new person will be elected to take over after her. There is an ethos, and we kind of touched on it. We talked about Anglican Communion. There is an ethos to Anglicanism. I'm going to hint at it only here very quickly before we close off this session. There's a respect, I would say, for the intellect and for the arts in our tradition. The arts reflected in part by choral evensong. If you're ever in England, you have a chance to go to a cathedral in the afternoon for evensong, go. It's musical arts. There are other arts that are also revered. Also for intellect. And so I have that old poster that was created once upon a time featuring our then presiding bishop, Catherine Jefferts Shorey. Don't believe in that crap, neither do we. So we don't struggle with some of the fights that other people have in other Christian traditions, I think in particular of evolution. And I think also our response to vaccines and masks and other sorts of things. I don't think our Episcopal Church has generally been very troubled by taking care of each other because we believe in science. I'm not going to read that. Some of you have seen this thing by Robin Williams about why he was an Episcopalian, about what he revered, and it's such a humorous thing.
Someone just said that to me.
It does end with I've seen it going around in social media again for some reason lately. It ends with all this stuff, and it says, no matter what you believe, there's bound to be at least one other Episcopalian who agrees with you. There's a broadness and an acceptance of different beliefs, because what unifies us, in fact, is not our beliefs, it's our prayers, which again is the whole point of the Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer, the prayers we say in common. is what unifies us, which is why liturgy is such a hard thing for us to wrestle with sometimes, because it's important. It's centrally important to our identity. The Via Media, which I have put in that corner there again. The sign there in that picture, middle ground, is a sign I took many years ago at Kenyon College in Ohio. Kenyon was established as an Episcopal seminary originally, and then expanded into a college. Well, it wasn't the other way around. It might have been the other way around. An Episcopal college that turned into a seminary. In any event, it had both identities in its history. And there's a pathway that goes through the center of campus. It's called Middle Ground. And hardly any students these days probably know the origin of it. It was originally about the Via Media. That is a translation of Via Media. And its Episcopal identity was just right into this pathway that goes right down the center of campus. And the coffee shop there, Middle Path, I think, is the walkway. And Middle Ground is a coffee shop there, which is another play on the words, which they do without necessarily knowing that it all links back to Via Media. So in essentials, unity, and non-essentials, liberty, and all things charity. That's not unique to the Episcopal Church, but I think it holds. And a Celtic inheritance, and I'm not going to read that creed there, but I will leave you here in the room with this thing that I came across many, many years ago about our Celtic tradition. Again, it's more familial, it's more DNA stuff. It's not necessarily, well, it's not at all legislative. But I think if you read this and you find things that resonate, you might say, oh, it's not just me individually, it's part of who we are as a denomination, as part of that bigger Anglican community. And that must end. Oh, next week again, questions, bring your questions. Okay, I am over time. So I'm going to sign off unless some of you at home, two of you at home have anything to add. No? Okay, thank you all. Ending recording. Ending our session. Good day.